Have you faced racism? Did you protest apartheid? We discuss the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, its origins, and our own perspectives on race and racism in a conversation with Dr. Erwin Warkentin. Welcome to Tales Under the Cat Tree. I'm your host, Dupes, and these are tales by humans for humans. After all, words and stories are what give meaning to the worlds we live in. This podcast is going to be going out on the week of March 21st. And March 21st is a very interesting day. It is designated the United Nations Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. In South Africa, it is also the Day of Human Rights. This international day comes from an event that happened in South Africa in 1960. And this was the Sharpeville Massacre. This happened at the height of apartheid and the beginning of what would become the armed uprisings from the ANC and other groups in South Africa. Now, today, I have my good friend and former professor, Dr. Warkentin, Erwin Warkentin, on the show with me today.
Hi, how are you?
We're going to have a conversation about both this event and race and racial discrimination.
The funny thing is that all of this happened about a year or so, not even quite a year after I was born. So what we're talking about is my lifespan.
This is true.
Essentially.
Well, and the funny thing is, we met while I was a student at Memorial University, and my master's degree in history was around Sharpeville, and that was with my mentor, your colleague and friend, Dr. Youé. My thesis was on how Sharpeville actually came to be and what actually caused that massacre. For those that, I also just realized that apartheid has now been ended for almost 35 years. It's been dismantled in South Africa. There are many people who are born, have grown up, have children, and have never lived in a world where you would hear any news about apartheid. And I thought maybe we could start there. We could actually describe what apartheid actually is.
Well, apartheid was this strange thing that happened where white people decided, that they were going to live separate. I suppose that it had happened in the past. There's certainly a historical precedent for it, but it kind of reached its culmination in South Africa.
For those that don't know, the British Empire had many colonies, but there were only about 6 really big colonies that were considered dominions of the British Empire. There was Canada, there was Newfoundland, there was the Irish Free State, Australia, South Africa, and these states were very, very much independent of the British Crown by the time of the early 20th century. In South Africa, they wanted to have a white minority rule over the black majority. And one of the things they did was to pass laws which restricted the movement of black peoples from different areas of the country in an attempt to keep the races separated. And this became the policy of apartheid. And the movement was controlled by pass laws. And what I found interesting, and one of the reasons why I have Erwin chatting with me, is that in the history of all of this, these pass laws didn't come from some magical, mythical idea in South Africa. They actually came from a country that you and I both deeply love and are citizens of, which is
Canada.
Exactly. It was part of the reservation system, the Indian Act of Canada.
Funny thing is that I can still remember a time when the Aboriginal people, the people, First Nations, couldn't vote in Canada. And these are things that have happened in my lifetime. I mean, they weren't the only ones that were restricted from voting, but they were the ones that were kind of restricted from voting based on who they were in terms of their ethnic background. And I use ethnic here kind of advisedly because I also have a bit of a history in my background of my people not being allowed to vote in Canada. That is, for a long time, there were parts of Canada where Mennonites were not allowed to vote.
I didn't actually know that.
Yes, specifically Mennonite men.
And why was that?
Because when the Mennonites came to Canada, they came to Canada with the provision that they wouldn't have to serve in the military. Mennonites are pacifists. If you know anything about my history, I'm not very good at that part of it, being a pacifist. At least my whole family has not been particularly good at it. But because they were pacifists, the Canadian government had said, well, you don't have to serve in the military. In British Columbia, where the last laws were stricken for men not being able to vote, the federal law was different again. And there, the federal government kind of took this position of, oh, well, we didn't realize it at the time, but those things were all provincial responsibilities. So you can't hold us to this agreement because we were in no position to actually sign it.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's one of these interesting, and I'm not trying to compare this to what happened in South Africa. In South Africa and in other places, it was far more vicious.
Well, even in Canada, I mean, still today, we are paying the price for the reservation system and the ways that it has gone through history. I think this is personally my view. If you have a country and you put borders inside for a group of people by some sort of ethnographic or ethnicity, race, whatever. I keep thinking back to the Star Trek episode where they had an episode in the 1960s, Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek, where they found a planet where there was two groups of people. One had white patches on their left side and the other had white patches on their right side. Otherwise, they were exactly identical, but these were, of course, two different races and they were at war with each other. But this is what happens. And if you take, I think if you take any country, whether it's South Africa or Canada, and you put these kind of artificial blocks in place, but the movement is being controlled not by the two societies, it's actually being controlled by the majority or the minority in South Africa's case that held the power, then you basically created an artificial economic incentive system to basically abuse one group or the other, which is what happened in both places, I think.
Yeah. I think that's very true. The other interesting thing in all of this is, in Canada we have reservations, but the Mennonites that came to Manitoba, we also lived on reserves. There was the East Reserve and the West Reserve. It was not as nasty a system as it was for the Aboriginal people. We could kind of move off of the reserve. As a child, I would ask my parents, do we live on a reserve or did we live on a reserve? And my mother would have to say, yes, we did. But how do you explain that to a 5-year-old?
We as humans, we put these barriers between people and we say, it's race or religion or it's a group of this or group of that. It's this otherization tactic that we use. In South Africa, it was taken to an extreme.
Yeah.
And I guess in Canada with the First Nations as well. For those, again, who don't know what happened in 66 years ago on the 21st of March, the people were just outside of Johannesburg. The people were protesting the pass laws. It was a day of action that had been called by the PAC, the Pan-Africanist Congress. Not many places actually decided to have a big protest, but there was one here in Sharpeville. And what's really quite fascinating about this was they were protesting the pass laws. Yes, absolutely. But just recently they had actually changed the bus prices as well. And the people needed to take the buses into Johannesburg to work. And this was an added burden on a group of people who were already downtrodden. So when they got to this protest, there was a wall of police, of course, against them. And supposedly, one police officer panicked, shot, and within 2 minutes, I believe, some hundreds of bullets were fired at the crowds. Many of them were hit in the back as they ran away. The official accounts, I believe, was 70 dead or something like that and 140 injured. But
the unofficial numbers are a little bit higher than that. But it's one of these things where they argue back and forth about exactly how many were killed in that. I mean, one person is too many. And, sometimes we want to, use these higher numbers as some sort of measure of how horrible something was. But, at some point, it's just a number. One is too many.
One is too many. And the interesting thing in the history of South Africa after this is this massacre, the Sharpeville Massacre, is what then leads to the next few years. It leads to Nelson Mandela and the ANC basically going from passive resistance to a much more direct resistance against the apartheid regime. Nelson Mandela gets, of course, incarcerated just I think a couple years after this. And then the whole thing goes all the way until basically the late 80s when I watched as a kid Nelson Mandela walk free. And for me, growing up, I don't know about you, Erwin, but for me growing up, apartheid was this thing because I'm a colored person living as a minority in almost every place that I grew up in, and even when I came to Canada. And so apartheid was something that was, as a teenager, was this thing that I absolutely wanted ended. It just felt so wrong that in the late 20th century we had a society where a group of people, by just the fact that they looked different, could not actually have citizenship in their country.
It was a difficult thing for us to understand as children. It would be discussed. We'd hear about it in the news. And growing up in Winnipeg, in particular, the part of Winnipeg that I grew up in, I mean, I grew up where that was immigrant central. It was the first place where immigrants would buy a home. And, so you had the various waves of immigrants that moved through that neighborhood, and some of them remained behind. But I went to a school where we were a United Nations. Now, yes, the white students, the Caucasians, we were still the majority, shall we say? But even within that majority, we had the Italians, we had the Germans, we had the Brazilians, we had people from everywhere. We had quite a few schoolmates from Trinidad. And as we listened to these reports coming out of South Africa about apartheid, and even, I grew up knowing who Martin Luther King was down in the States. And listening to these reports about South Africa, we couldn't understand it. To us, it was just weird because you mean I'm supposed to not like this person over here because of the color of their skin? But man, he plays really good football. Why shouldn't I like him? Or I really like the food that he shares with me at lunchtime. We would often exchange our sandwiches, things like that at lunchtime. And to me, it was just really strange that this would be the case. I had a friend who was from, I think, the Bahamas. It was either Bermuda or the Bahamas, either one. In any case, he was a person of color, shall we say. And I guess I was about 10 years old, and I learned a very valuable lesson one day. I called him the N-word, and it wasn't through any sort of malice. It was simply a word that I'd heard being used. I don't even know where I necessarily picked it up. But no sooner had that word come out of my mouth than I thought the back of my head was going to explode. My father didn't spank us very often, but he heard that word come out of my mouth and he just wound up and he slapped me in the back of the head. And he got in my face and in German told me that no son of his was going to use that word to another person. I said to him, but why? I was confused. I don't know if it was the slap in the backside or whatever. I was confused. And I asked him why. My father had been a soldier in the Second World War on the German side. And he looked at me and he says, I know where words like that go. And my son's not going there. And that was it. There, no more from him. And I never did use that word again.
And I think it was the same for me in the sense that I grew up I grew up in Hong Kong in a school that was, as you said, United Nations. I mean, I went to what's called an English schools foundation school. So it was kind of semi-private, I think. And so it was all expatriates, the children of expatriates. I mean, it was basically a rainbow of colors and cultures and everything under the sun. And I never even thought of race. In fact, but what was really interesting for me growing up was that most of my friends made fun of each other's races. It wasn't mean or anything. It was actually, we knew we were different from each other. Mm-hmm. And that we liked different types of foods and that our families came from different cultures. And so for me, it was perfectly fine having a conversation about race with the people that I grew up with. Race wasn't a thing. It was just what made us who we are. It didn't make you any better or any worse than the person in front of you. Like it didn't matter. And what I found really quite fascinating was when I moved to Newfoundland, where I was such a visible minority. There, people were very concerned about offending me by maybe pointing out that I look different. I was like, no, I am very different. I can tell that. And in those days, I had a very British accent too.
Yeah, well, I do remember though, because in '94 when I started my career as a prof, in specific at MUN, I do remember one incident where you've always been really cool about it, saying didn't bother me, but it was those of us who are white that were horrified that someone would say this. And the person who had said it didn't really mean it with malice at all. They were simply making a comment on the color of your skin. They weren't Canadian. That's all they were doing. And so it was done very innocently. But the rest of us Canadians were just utterly horrified by this. I suppose I don't know if I should find it funny now. I guess there's enough years that have passed since there, and you seemed kind of cool with it. So maybe it's okay to eventually laugh at it. But this notion of laughing at one another's ethnic background or one's race is something that I think helps diffuse some of these situations. I've worked for over the years, before I went to university, I worked for a Jewish fellow, and he was he actually just passed away very, very recently. He almost no, actually he did. He did hit 100 years of age, and I worked for him and his wife. I remember a friend of his come running in one day and saying, "We're off the hook. We're off the hook." And I looked at him and said, "What are you talking about, Shlomo?" And he says, "Well, it's all your fault." I said, "What are you talking about?" And then he put the Winnipeg Free Press down in front of me. And one of the lead stories was that the Mennonites had become the richest minority in Manitoba. He says, "Now it's all your fault. From now on, all of the conspiracy theories, everything, it's all on your shoulders. It's not going to be our fault." He says, "I feel so liberated." And we just sat there and we stared at each other for a couple of seconds and we just burst out laughing at the situation. But that kind of helped, bridge some of these gaps between us.
Well, I have a rather interesting thing that happened when I was in Canada at one point. When I was, I think I was visiting Ontario, and I can't remember why. I was still living in Newfoundland at the time. I was chatting with someone, and somehow the topic with this person came out to be race, and they turned to me and said, "Well, you can't be racist." And I said, "Why not?" "Well, I mean, you're obviously non-white." And I went, "That's not true." do you know that I am born in a country where two peoples who are basically brown, who honestly, I wouldn't know the difference between a Tamil person and a Sinhalese person in terms of genetics. I'm sure I am as much Tamil as I'm Sinhalese, quote, quote, and quote, and they were in a civil war at the time based on race.
Yeah.
It completely arbitrary. When you think about the religious wars of between the Protestants and the Catholics and how incredibly violent they were, or the French Revolution between those who had money and those who did not have money, those who had land, those who did not have land. It doesn't matter which side. Like these things don't make any sense when you actually really think about it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, they simply don't make any sense, but yet it seems that we can't get by without it.
Well, this comes down to the 21st of March. On the one side, whenever I come to the 21st of March, I keep thinking, both spring is coming. It's the vernal equinox, and thinking about the elimination of racism and thinking, when does this end actually happen? I know why it happens. I understand it's stupid. It's there, but it always just makes me think about this arbitrary thing that we do and we call race, and then we throw it at people.
Yeah. I actually had some contact with some of the people that were involved in, the whole changeover in South Africa. I met Desmond Tutu. I met a few of the other people who had been in government at the time. And one of the things that remained with me was this was one of the white ministers who had been in government at the time. And he admittedly he said at the time, he says, I was one of these arch apartheid apologists. What he told me was that it was the grace that was offered him by people like Mandela afterwards. He had every reason in the world to hate my miserable guts. That's the way he put it. But apparently he didn't. And he made it quite clear he wasn't going to be treated that way. For him, he said that turned me, that broke me. I just couldn't continue on the way I had before. And so I think we had a very unique human being who then became, I guess, president of South Africa, and that he managed to turn the situation around. Yes, they had truth and reconciliation and all of that came afterwards, but I think it was this one individual who, by his very grace, who had every reason in the world to hate the people that had done this to him, who decided to do otherwise.
But isn't that the only way to eliminate racism? Is to admit to each other that we are flawed, that we do otherize lots of different things. In a business, we otherize the leaders. We say, them lot. In life, we look at races and religions and everything else. But the truth is, I talk to you and I say, hey, Erwin, I'm sorry for having what happened, but hey, let's just move on and let's talk about what actually connects us and do it in peace.
Yeah, easier said than done, though.
It is, but it is what we should be practicing. I wish this was what every child learned in school, to take that little bit of peace. I wish that was. I know I'm living in a utopian, lovely world, but...
Well, I was going to say, whatever you're smoking, why don't you send some my way? No, I absolutely understand, but I'm also enough of a realist to realize that it takes an exceptional human being to take that step, to make that step. Because if Nelson Mandela had suddenly turned around and taken revenge, I don't know if I could have blamed him. How could I say to him now, well, no, you shouldn't treat him that way. You know, I think it would be so much better, if you treated them with love and respect and show them a different way of doing things. And if he didn't take my advice, I don't know if I could have blamed him, but he didn't. And that's the exceptional thing.
But he didn't, and it was exceptional. And I, to this day, and I'm going to, in the show notes, link a song called Asimbonanga, which was a song for Nelson Mandela when he was incarcerated. And they're playing it in Berlin. This way after he had been released. I think it was in like 1998. And he comes on stage. You just watch him and you realize how much grace he had to be able to calm an entire nation, to not completely destroy the economy, and yet bring apart some sort of reconciliation. It's still, as I understand it, still a mess, and lots of things still need to be done. And it'll probably be for several generations. These things aren't undone, at an instant. Look at Canada. Have we undone the wrongs and the ills of colonial Britain?
No, we haven't. We still see a lot of the after effects of that. And even within the Aboriginal communities, we have issues where you now have groups that are starting to fight amongst themselves. We also have this non-recognition in some cases of the Métis in Canada, which again is this odd sort of racial designation that you don't always know what to do with. And we had in the school that I went to, we had a lot of Métis students. They themselves didn't know where to put themselves, in the grand scheme of things. And very often in talking about Aboriginal rights and that, we've kind of ignored them entirely. And so I think we still have a long way to go.
And I think, again, it comes down to us as individuals. And I'll bring it to a close here. But, Erwin, thank you very much for coming on the show with me and talking about it.
It's a good conversation.
It's a difficult subject. And, there are people on both sides of this everywhere. I'm okay with this race, but that race is not so good. But, this comes down to us as individuals and what we think about our fellow human. There are more things that connect us than our differences.
It's one of these odd things that, for some reason, we want to gravitate to, supposedly, in quotation marks, our kind. Yeah. In closing, it's one of these things that even, growing up, what do you mean you're not going out with a good German girl? I did end up marrying a good German girl, but it was one of these things that you would hear from people. And it wasn't just unique to the German community. It was any one of the communities.
Oh, this is true. I can look through my life history, and there's been many times where people have been shown ignorance to me or my culture or whatever they thought my culture was. Yeah. And then, of course, there's been outright racism. But I have always chosen to take the path, and I hope I can continue to do so, that once anyone gets to know me, you and I will end up having a great conversation about something.
And if nothing else, we can laugh about our ethnic background.
Exactly. Thank you very much. I can only hope that one day we do see that the day for the elimination of racial discrimination is not needed.
Yeah. Yep. It'll be one of these quaint remembrances.
One can only hope. Thank you very much, Erwin.
Thank you.
Thank you to my friend and mentor, Dr. Erwin Warkentin, for joining me for this conversation. You can tell that we can go on forever on certain subjects, and this happens to be one of them. Erwin will be joining me in further episodes as we explore everything from propaganda to different writing styles. Dr. Warkentin is a frequent guest and collaborator on this podcast. To get more of Dr. Warkentin, I can suggest episode number 40, The Sin of I, where we talk about the role of perspective and loss in autobiography and autobiographical fiction. Episode number 24, The Bride Price and Criticism, where Erwin and I break down a piece of autobiography of my past in Papua New Guinea. Episode 15, From Russia Without Love, where Erwin and I discuss a short story he wrote on the Stalinist purges. And episode 11 on the emotions of autobiography, where I read a piece of autobiography from Erwin about his childhood and his mother growing up in Winnipeg. I hope you enjoy our conversations as much as I do and find them thought-provoking. Thank you for listening to another episode of Tales Under the Cat Tree. Listen to the archives wherever you get your podcasts or at tales.dupes.ca. That's TALES.DUPS.ca. This podcast is about the worlds we create, the realities we conjure, and the wonders of the human condition. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please help me reach more people by subscribing or sharing this episode. This podcast, including its intro music, is produced, edited, and created by Youé. Give your pets a cuddle until we meet again for some tales under the cat tree.